Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk a little bit about paint thickness gauges and paint correction, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why a paint thickness gauge can be a bad thing for your paint correction and also help set some realistic expectations. Come check it out. All right, so first things first, you see this a lot in the detailing groups. People are asking for, what's the best paint thickness gauge for the money and so forth and so on. The first thing to understand is that if you are spending less than a couple $1,000s, or if you're spending in the hundreds, you are not getting a paint thickness gauge that is going to work on all surfaces. You're going to get a paint thickness gauge. So like if you're spending $100, $200, $300, you're going to get a paint thickness gauge that only works on metal. It will not work on, say, a bumper or a composite or carbon fiber. It has to have some sort of metal substrate underneath it. Okay, so that's sort of to set some expectation management. First off, that's the kind of paint thickness gauge you're going to get. Now, furthermore, you're only going to, if you're getting a paint thickness gauge like this, it's only going to measure the total distance between the substrate and the surface. All right, so what does that mean? You got the metal, right? And then you got primer, and then you got a base coat, which is going to be like the white, and then we're going to have a clear coat, which is going to give it that glossy look and UV protection, and that's going to be on the top. So the paint thickness gauge is going to give you the total measurement between all those surfaces. So you're not going to get a breakdown, and we're talking about like the less expensive ones, right? Not the super expensive ones. The less expensive ones are going to give you a total thickness, but they're not going to tell you what the thickness of the primer is, of the base coat, right? So, you could get a reading that seems like you have a lot of paint, but really it's mostly primer and base coat, and there's very little clear coat. And then of course, once you go through the clear coat, you've messed up. So they do have paint thickness gauges that use like an ultrasound, and some of these gauges are in the $1,800 to $3,000 range, and they will measure bumpers, and then some of them, separate gauge, will measure individual layers on metal surfaces. So it'll be able to tell you, break it down, what is primer, what is base coat, what is clear coat. Okay, so just understand that when people are asking about paint thickness gauges and they're buying paint thickness gauges, generally speaking, they're buying these, okay? And this is not going to give you readings on bumpers. It's not going to give you individual layers. So why did I decide to make this video? Well, I recently came across a post asking for some help in one of the professional groups. And this isn't to make fun of the person whatsoever. But this person, they measured using a paint thickness gauge. They had 4 something mils or 5 something mils of thickness. And they continued to polish at a scratch and ended up burning through the clear coat, through the base coat, and down to the primer. Now, if you look at it, and this is what I responded in the thread, if you look at the spot in question, because he did have some video of it prior to working on it, you can see with your eye better than you can see with one of these multi-$100 or $100 paint thickness gauges, that paint area was too thin. You could already see a hazy spot or a shadowy spot where you could tell that it had been repaired. And so in this case, our eyes are better than the paint thickness gauge. Sometimes the paint thickness gauge gives us a false sense of security. So he measured it, he got what he thought was an acceptable thickness to polish, and then when he polished it, he basically, the panel was already kind of messed up, but he kind of ruined the rest of the panel. The only option now is a repaint. And potentially an expensive lesson to learn, depending on what your insurance deductible is, or if you're paying out of pocket. But that's why, so it can give us a false sense of security. So it's important to understand that, we don't always want to rely on this. We first want to visually check. And there are a couple tricks that people use because door jambs are like typically the thinnest portion of the car and very rarely clear coated, what people would do is they'll measure the door jamb and then measure a suspected part, subtract the difference, and estimate that that is the thickness of the clear coat in that area. The other issue is the paint thickness gauge has this probe, and you can set it on continuous or you can click it from area to area. But if you have a very small area, unless you're measuring every single piece, you may not find that if it's repainted well, but still, like if it's blended well that you can't see it visually, you may still be missing it, even with the paint thickness gauge, if you don't happen to probe that area. Because paint thickness, even from robots, tends to vary from spot to spot on the panels. And I'm going to show you an example of how to use this particular gauge on my CT4V Blackwing right now. This actually works out pretty well because I just haven't had time to do it, but I will soon. This quarter panel on this car, it doesn't have any PPF on it. It's one of the only panels on my car that doesn't. The roof, however, has 2 layers of PPF, the carbon fiber and the regular PPF. The door only has 1 layer of PPF. So I say all that to show you the differences. So here we have a painted surface, metal surface. I'm going to scan it, and we're going to get 5.57 mils. Scan it over here, 6.67. See how it varies? And then like 5.19. So we kind of want to take an average, 5.22, and we can change it to a continuous mode, which will allow us to kind of just scan it over the panel like this. And now it's into the 4s right here. Could have been polished there, could have just been happenstance. All right, so now I'm gonna scan the door. So the door is measured at 13.34 mils. Now, our PPF that we use, Autobahn Incognito, it's 8 mil thick. So, 13.34, that checks out, right? So like I said, it doesn't measure what is what. So this has PPF on it. So really the paint is probably about 5.34 mils thick. Now I'm gonna measure the roof, which I told you had 2 layers of PPF. So here we have 22.4 mils. So you figure 8 plus 8, you got 16. So there's a good 6 mils on the roof here. 5 and some change, 4 and some change, 6. So you can see how it varies from panel to panel. And so if you have this little spot, like you may not check that particular area. So now we're going to check the door jamb and compare it to the other side. So here we have 5.87 mils, and then let's go into the door jamb here. It's nice and dirty, but 4.58. So it's really not, it's kind of like within that tolerance in a sense. But here it's 3.53 mils on this intersection. 3 mils here. 3.5. So let's call it an average of 3.25, even though most of my readings are in the 3.5, but this one's 2.9. So if we say it's like 3.25, and we measure here, and we get 4.7, we could estimate, ballpark, that there's about 1.5 mils of clear coat in this particular area, because we've taken the inner door jamb and we have subtracted that from the outer painted surface. So here it's 7.48 mils, right? So up here we have more paint. And then 5.7, 5.9, 5.3, so let's call it like 5.5, and this is 3.25, so maybe we have 2.25 mils in this area, and that's how people will tell you to get a ballpark of how much clear coat you have on the outside by measuring against the inner door jamb. So hopefully this was helpful, giving you some insight on paint thickness gauges.